Hello, my name is Mark and this is my channel Discography Deep Dives. The purpose of this channel is to look at different artists' entire bodies of work and talk about them in a casual manner. I've been collecting records since I was 13 and I'm always looking for new stuff to listen to. The challenge for me is that some of these artists have decades of work to sift through. So together we're going to go artist by artist to find the good stuff, the bad stuff, and the in-between stuff. But first I'd like to talk about my 5 favorite artists so you get an idea of my sense of preferences. So my 5th favorite artist is Frank Zappa. He was active from the mid 60s to the early 90s. He's a name many are not familiar with. He wasn't a very commercially successful musician in the sense of someone like the Beatles or the Rolling Stones. Uh, his music is very strange, it's very different. He uses odd time signatures, the lyrics are often very satirical or comical. Like on this album, for example, he uses a xylophone very frequently, and that was a theme of his early 70s work with his band. This one in particular is Overnight Sensation. It was released on September 7th, 1973. It contains songs like Montana, Zombie Woof, I'm the Slime. The thing that's really interesting, I think, about his music is that it's just so different. There's no one who sounds like him. There was no one who sounded like him before. Him himself, he thought of himself more as a composer than a rock star. He's an incredible guitarist. I think he's my favorite by far. An album for his guitar work would probably be Joe's Garage, in particular a song called Watermelon and Easter Hay. It's a roughly 7-minute just guitar solo, but it's very beautiful. This album wasn't very successful relatively to other classics and other albums I'll talk about. This hit number 32 in the Billboard 200. He never really had hits. His 2 most famous songs are probably Valley Girl and Don't Eat the Yellow Snow, and it's just because they're novelty songs that just kind of caught on. And I think that's a shame, but I don't think the world could really appreciate what he brought to the table. I think it's something you have to listen to with an open mind, and I think just a song coming on the radio, you're not gonna do that. What I would say if you listen to it, Frank Zappa or try, it's definitely good to start with an album like Overnight Sensation. Depending on what you're into, if you like jazz or something like that, jazz fusion, Hot Rats is a good choice. It's almost entirely instrumental. I remember when I first tried to listen to Frank Zappa, I listened to the album Studio Tan because it was the cheapest record of his, and I'd always heard of him. And the first song I heard was The Adventures of Gregory Peccary, and it was a 20-minute song of a weird voice just saying Gregory Peccary and stuff like that, and I just didn't get it. And after listening to it a few times, because I was like, something's got to be here if he's released so many albums. He was releasing almost 2 albums a year at one point. He has one of the largest discographies of any artist that I can think of. And then I flipped to the B side of the album, and it was a lot more just strange stuff. But I decided to dig through, and I found a chart of how to listen to Frank Zappa, and I ended up finding my way to Overnight Sensation. I found it at a record store in Woodbridge, Virginia, and I listened to it, and I thought, wow, this is actually really cool. The lyrics are strange. For example, one song in here, Montana. It's about moving to Montana and raising dental floss. I mean, it's weird, but it's fun. It's very artistic. He was an interesting man himself. He testified in front of Congress in the PMRC congressional hearing, and he was very eloquent, and he's a very intelligent man. He really just tried to push the boundaries. Even though he came up in the 60s and lived in the Laurel Canyon, he was an anti-hippie, didn't like drugs, even though he made some of the wackiest out there music you could think of. So I don't think he's someone for everybody, but if you're looking to expand the way you think of music, I think he's a good choice. But definitely start with something like Overnight Sensation. So my 4th favorite artist is Bruce Springsteen. I got into Bruce Springsteen when I was 20, about to be 21. I was actually going to go see him in concert in Virginia Beach. It's hard for me to pick a favorite album of his. I went with Born in the USA here. I really enjoy every album he did leading up to this and the few afterwards. I mean, you could have picked Born to Run, Darkness on the Edge of Town, or The River. I strongly considered The River first, but I picked this one just because my favorite song of all time is Dancing in the Dark, which is on this album. This album in particular came out on June 4th, 1984. It was a number one. It was the number one selling album of 1985. Went platinum 15 times in the United States, and it sold 30 million copies worldwide. I mean, this was Springsteen's commercial peak. I think these are the songs that most people associate him with. But he was a great songwriter, and he still is. I'm not too much of a fan of a lot of his recent work compared to this stuff. I think early Springsteen is really interesting as well. He was very heavily influenced by someone like Bob Dylan. Like his first album, it's like rapid fire, like he's reading from a dictionary. The words he's using, the phrases. And a lot of people appreciated his work before he even became a star. David Bowie recorded It's Hard to Be a Saint in the City. The Greg Kinnear Band recorded For You. Manfred Mann and the Earth Band had a number one hit with Blinded by the Light, written by him. And the thing I think that really exemplifies his music is just the way he could write about regular people. He really had a good insight on what it's like to be a regular working person. The values they have, the lifestyle, and I think that really connected with an audience of people. I think sometimes he could be considered a little controversial just because of his political leanings. Maybe not controversial, but I think a lot of people prefer their musicians to stay out of politics. And he makes it pretty well known where he is. Personally, when I listen to him, I don't consider that stuff. I mean, some of the music does get a little political, but I like to put it off to the side, or I use it as a chance to get a better understanding of someone else's position, whether I agree or disagree with it. But overall, I think Springsteen is a very easy artist to get into. He's got a lot of music to listen to. I mean, he has outtake albums that are just as good as a regular album. Like the Tracks album is fantastic. I mean, I love a lot of those songs on it, and they're in my Springsteen playlist I listen to all the time. If I were going to recommend Springsteen to somebody, I would tell them to start with probably something like Born in the USA or Born to Run. So those would be my recommendations if you haven't listened to Springsteen and you'd like to get into him. So my third favorite artist of all time is Bob Dylan. And here I have his album Highway 61 Revisited. It was released on August 30th, 1965. It went number 3 in the US Billboard 200. It's went platinum once. I had a hard time choosing between this and Blood on the Tracks, but this album itself is a landmark for the 60s. And I think it best shows who Bob Dylan is. This album opens with is probably his most iconic song, Like a Rolling Stone, and I think that's a song that really captures the feeling of the 1960s and the music. A lot of people say this album and that song in particular are what started the 60s as we think about it in hindsight. This album is just full of good songs. I mean, they're not hit songs you'd hear on the radio or people are going to play on oldies stations like Tombstone Blues and Queen Jane Approximately, just like Tom Thumb's Blues, Desolation Row. Bob Dylan's background is in folk. His early albums are just guitar and harmonica mostly. And then he controversially went to electric with albums like this. And it turned off a lot of his folk fans, but really brought him more into the pop scene, I guess, and into like the mainstream more. Even though he had songs like The Times They Are A-Changin' and Don't Think Twice It's Alright. But his discography is huge. He's been around. I think his first album was 1961, and he's been putting out music pretty relatively consistently. I think he had an album just last year. I think he had a single last year too, his 20-minute song, more like a poem. He's been on his never-ending tour since the 80s. He's still around. He's still making music. He's probably the greatest songwriter of all time. in an artistic sense, I'd say. He's very good at just using his words and metaphors. He's very well read with poetry and literature and history. And you see that in his work. Like, I have to dissect it and like go through it. Like a song on here like Desolation Row is just, it's just full of so much stuff and references that on first listen it's not very clear, and then, you know, looking at the lyrics and researching it, it's so interesting. That's what I love about music, especially someone like Bob Dylan. I think a lot of his later work starts to lack. I think by the 80s, I think he's definitely trying to hang on with the times instead of embracing who he is as an artist. He's lost a lot of that folk sensibility by then, but he's written so many iconic songs. I mean, just think of something like Knocking on Heaven's Door or Forever Young. I think if you want to listen to Bob Dylan, I think you might be better off listening to one of his greatest hits albums, or jumping into Highway 61 Revisited. Or if you really like country stuff, maybe I'd start with Blood on the Tracks, which I think is probably the greatest breakup album ever written. Also stated that in the show Californication, which is a good show if anyone's never seen it. But when I got into Bob Dylan, I actually did it a little reverse. I'd heard songs like Knocking on Heaven's Door or something like that before. But how I got into him is the same way I got into the Grateful Dead. They actually had a live album together called Dylan and the Dead. It's an album that is not very well regarded by either Dylan fans or Grateful Dead fans, but I've always liked it. I don't know why people hate on it so much. Bob Dylan's voice isn't the best, and I think it wasn't the best on that album either. I mean, that's the thing too, Bob Dylan. I think a lot of people don't like his voice. It's very nasally. It's not someone who's going to win like America's Got Talent or American Idol or something like that. But that's really not the point of his songs. His voice has some character, and it's more about his lyrics and the story he's telling you. So definitely someone I would recommend. And I think just start off with like Rolling Stone and go from there on a greatest hits album. Throw it on shuffle. So my second favorite band of all time is the Rolling Stones, the greatest rock and roll band of all time. And this album in particular is Let It Bleed, released on the 28th of November 1969. The US number 3, UK number 1, 2 times platinum. This one was significant because their band leader Brian Jones was fired during the making of this album, replaced with Mick Taylor. So this is really where Mick Jagger and Keith Richards fully take over as being the leaders of the band. The Rolling Stones are just one of the greatest musical artists of all time. I think we're all familiar with hits like I Can't Get No Satisfaction, Ruby Tuesday. On this album, like You Can't Always Get What You Want, Start Me Up, Miss You, Beast of Burden. They have so many hits. And they're a band I think you can easily get away with. If you don't really know a lot about them, you can hop right into one of their greatest hits albums. And those are filled with a lot of their singles too, like songs like Jumpin' Jack Flash. And then once you get a good taste for that, I think it's very easy to get into the rest of these albums because they're filled with a lot of songs that aren't like those stadium rock anthems. Like on this one, it has a lot of country on it, like country blues. And I think at first that might be a little unappealing, especially if you're not really into country or the blues. But for me, I think they were a good opening into that kind of genre. I like country, but a lot of the older country, like Glenn Campbell, Johnny Cash kind of stuff. But this goes a little step further back. You can't really go wrong picking a Rolling Stones album, especially out of that classic period of Beggar's Banquet, Goat's Head Soup, Exile on Main Street. Even later albums, like Tattoo You, that's a good one too, especially for their 80s material. Steel Wheels. So I think they're an easy artist for someone to get into, and I think they've earned the legacy they have. They're great songwriters, great musicians. You can see why they're still that big tour draw they are today. So if you're looking to get into them, just put on one of their greatest hits albums and enjoy. And then once you get through that, you want to look for more, start with something like Let It Bleed. So my favorite artist of all time is the Beatles. Anyone who knows me, this isn't a shock. So my favorite album by the Beatles is my favorite album of all time. It's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, released May 26, 1967, worldwide #1, 11 times platinum, went to #3 as recently as 2017. What's there to be said about the Beatles that hasn't been said before? They're the greatest artist of all time. They're not the greatest rock and roll band in the sense that the Rolling Stones are, that fill up stadiums and play these great rock and stadium arena tracks. That's just not what the Beatles were. They were more artistic. They quit touring by this point to focus on the studio, and they were making so many innovations at times like these. I think a lot of people are resistant to like the Beatles just because it's kind of cool to hate on, who's the most successful at times. I didn't like the Beatles at first either. Growing up, I really loved things like the Red Hot Chili Peppers or whatever was on Tony Hawk's Pro Skater games. That's what I really liked in music originally. And the first two Beatles songs I ever heard were Long and Winding Road and I'm the Walrus. I didn't like it. I thought it was soft, or I thought it was weird. But after listening to like their #1 hit single CD, I really learned to love them and I got more into them. And my first records I ever had were almost all Beatles records, though the exception was a George Harrison record. Who was the lead guitarist for the Beatles. And this also includes their solo work in this category. If not, Paul McCartney would have got another slot on this and bumped off Frank Zappa, which I think would have been a little counterproductive, and it's redundant to include him again. I think Lennon and McCartney is the greatest songwriting duo of all time, and Paul McCartney is the master of writing pop songs. He wrote just so many great songs, and he still does. His last album, McCartney 3, written by himself and performed by himself, it's mind-blowing. He's still doing it, and he's on tour all the time, and I've seen him live. He's fantastic. I just think if you are someone who doesn't like the Beatles, I think it's always a good thing to open your mind and just try and listen to them. Check out the Past Masters set. The early stuff, the early rock and roll simplistic stuff might not be your thing, but start around something like Day Tripper, We Can Work It Out, those kind of songs in the album, and go through that. And I think you'll really enjoy them. They changed their style constantly. They never stayed in one sound. They would continue to innovate. After this album, which is very psychedelic, they went into the White Album, which strips away all that. Then you go into Abbey Road, Let It Be. And then their solo work's also very interesting. I think George Harrison had a lot of good stuff with his album All Things Must Pass. John Lennon's is a lot more personal. Ringo Starr's is kind of goofy. I mean, what do you expect from the drummer, I guess? And then Paul McCartney, he just started writing a lot of great pop songs and other great stuff like Band on the Run, silly love songs. So give the Beatles a shot if you never have. And if you love the Beatles like I do, well, you already know. So that's my top 5 favorite artists. So let me know in the comments who your top 5 favorite are, your top 5 favorite albums, something you'd like to hear me talk about, break down. My next video will be on Bruce Springsteen. We're going to start with his first 4 albums at least, and we're going to break them down a little more in depth than I did with these. And I'll tell you some good tracks on it that I really liked, songs I'd skip, or I wouldn't put in my playlist, or if I'd skip the album, recommend the album. And we'll go from there. Thank you for joining me.